Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to the case study on solarization of pumping stations in Arsal, Lebanon. I work indeed for the International Committee of the Red Cross, in short ICRC, which is a Swiss organization based in Geneva, and we are responding to humanitarian crises in settings of conflict and other situations of violence worldwide since more than 150 years. In Lebanon, the ICRC has been working since 1948 and established a permanent delegation with its own office in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, in 1967. I work for the Water and Habitat Unit of the ICRC, which is the engineering department of this organization. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in this case study, I will present to you how we used solar energy to successfully increase the water production in the remote town of Arsal in Lebanon. The presentation is one slide back, please. It's loading very slowly. The presentation is structured in a short introduction on the context here in Lebanon in general, and then more specifically on Arsal. I will give you a short explanation of ICRC's systemic support approach, a brief overview of the water system in Arsal city, and an explanation on the main problematic we faced in terms of electricity, and then an overview on the implemented solar project, talking briefly about our key design considerations and the final system configuration. We then conclude, and I'm happy to take questions. So we will talk about water supply, but we have to keep in mind that the availability of electricity is really the limitation to basically all services, including water. Next slide, please. Why is the ICRC working in Lebanon, and why in Arsal? Lebanon, already weakened by 15 years of civil war from 1975 to 1990, and then the war with Israel in 2006, suffered additional pressure on its resources and services since the onset of the Syrian crisis. On about 4.2 million Lebanese living here, an additional 1.5 million Syrian refugees arrived, fleeing the conflict and violence in their home country. Arsal is a town located in the Bekaa highlands, close to the Syrian border. In Arsal, 42,000 mostly Sunni Lebanese, traditionally with cultural and economic ties to Syria, welcomed about 100,000 Syrian refugees. Today, about 40,000 refugees remain in informal tented settlements. These are the red triangles you can see on the map all around the city of Arsal. And the initially warm welcoming cooled down soon after, because it also meant much more difficult living conditions for the host communities. The humanitarian situation worsened in summer 2014 after an attempt of the Lebanese armed forces to control the area. Back then, the ICRC was one of the very few humanitarian organizations that was actually capable of working in Arsal. And in response to a disastrous humanitarian crisis, we managed to set up a large humanitarian assistance program, providing shelter assistance. We worked with water systems, we provided healthcare services, and we ran livelihood assistance programs. As an emergency response, we, the engineering department, repaired Arsal's water pumping station several times, and we supplied fuel to run backup generators. The situation lasted for no less than 3 years, until summer 2017, when the Lebanese armed forces managed to control the situation. With the improved stability and security, we were also able to adapt our support from being mostly reactive to proactive. That means we started working on a systemic level rather than as an emergency response. Next slide, please. I would like to briefly explain what I mean when I talk about systemic support. Systemic support means to consider systems as a whole. It is very important to understand that it requires a good understanding of the system and that you have to think in a long-term way. So we think in three categories. One is the infrastructure, then we have the financial and human resources, and finally we have a management model. And these three categories are all interdependent and equally important for the system to function. Let's consider a water system in these three categories. So infrastructure, we need for the water system to run functional hardware. For example, a submersible pump, an electric control board, or solar panels. But then we need also financial and human resources. We need skilled operators. We need financial means to pay for salaries and to pay for maintenance. And finally, we need a management model. We need a management model to allow us organizing tasks and to link, for example, consumers for complaint management or billing to the infrastructure where we do read water meters or where we perform maintenance. So the systemic support stands for the reconciliation of all these three fields in a comprehensive way to ensure a functional service provision balanced between these three fields. And I would like to refer at this point to a publication from 2015 done by the engineering unit of the ICRC that is called Urban Services During Protracted Armed Conflict. And if you're interested, I warmly invite you to read this reference. But then the objective is not only to help the system provide its service better in terms of quality and quantity, but also to make it more resilient to resisting possible future shocks to the system. Shocks can be situations of armed conflict, effects of the climate crisis, or economic difficulties. In order to achieve that, we work closely with the responsible authorities, both on ministry and on field level. And is really thanks to this good cooperation that we have in Lebanon that we are in a position to positively contribute to improve the situation of the Lebanese resident population and Syrian refugees alike. Next slide, please. The infrastructure and public services in Lebanon remain highly deficient, and electricity being the cornerstone of all public services, such as water supply or healthcare, is the bottleneck. The WEF Global Competitiveness Report from 2014 and 15 ranked Lebanon on rank 143 out of 144 in terms of quality of the electrical supply. Safe water supply remains not guaranteed, therefore, and the Ministry of Energy and Water is very well aware of this, and in the scope of the CEDR conference, electricity and water are high on the agenda with a total investment volume of about $8.8 billion. Arsal, that you, by the way, can see in the picture, is a remote rural town at about 1,550 meters above sea level, and it has been historically underserved by public services. Power is therefore no exception, and Arsal is served only by a very weak and unstable medium voltage power line coming from the lowlands. On a national level, the Ministry of Energy and Water is responsible for water services throughout the whole of Lebanon. In the Bekaa, this is the valley in the northeast, the ministry mandated the Bekaa water establishment as the entity in charge of water. In the past, Bekaa water establishment has been unable to guarantee a presence in Arsal, and this mainly because of the lack of resources. In the absence of national and regional authorities, a local water committee within Arsal municipality does its best to manage the water systems and keep them running, however, with largely unqualified personnel. Next slide, please. In Arsal, we try to work with all relevant authorities, bringing them closer together as various projects move forward. The water system has initially been designed to serve 32,000 inhabitants, but today it supplies only water to 6,700 people. In our systemic approach, we planned over 5 years, proposing to move forward step by step, aiming at the final objective. And this is presented in the table where you can see in blue and our projects that work mainly in in the sphere of infrastructure, where we try to increase water production, so solarization of boreholes, etc. In red, you can see mainly activities that target the management model. So in the first step, we try to monitor and understand the system, both from an overall, but also from an end user point of view. And finally, in green, we have activities in the sphere of management model and human and financial resources, where we support relevant authorities in managing their water systems better. But today we are going to talk mainly about the solarization project. And next slide, please. Thank you. So the main elements of the public water system in Arsal are the following. We have a water production by 4 wells with a total yield of about 40 liters per second. So we produce around 1,000 cubic meters per day. This water is then stored in 4 reservoirs that have a capacity of 6,000 cubic meters. And finally, from the tanks, the water is distributed through a network connecting about 11,200 people, or around 2,000 households. Now, this is only 35% of all residents in Arsal. Of course, the network has losses, and we estimate them to be between 25 to 50%, depending on the location. But if we now assume losses of 25%, and we use the national guideline for a good service level of 120 liters per person and day, the produced water is enough for about 9,000 individuals, which is only 25% of the host community. So as a result, residents in Arsal have to resort to very expensive coping mechanisms such as water trucking or small local private networks. But these solutions, they are about 3 times more expensive than the public water supply would actually cost. On the other hand, Syrian refugees are relatively well served through water trucking by international humanitarian actors. This leads to tensions as the host community feels overlooked. We can support these figures through a survey that we conducted initially to better understand the situation, and the results of this survey are visualized in the map as green dots, which indicate households that are receiving water, and red dots, which are interviewed households but not receiving water. Today, thanks to improvements, the medium voltage power line that supplies electricity from the Beka up to Arsal is providing electricity for about 12 hours a day. However, the electricity remains the main restriction to increase water production, and availability is limited and quality is not always sufficient. Several times pumps were burned due to power quality issues. To improve the situation, we designed and implemented 2 solar systems. The 2 systems are very similar in terms of specifications, and therefore I will focus in the rest of my presentation only on one of them. Next slide, please. When we talk now about the solar systems, I present you quickly the key design considerations. So one was to integrate the existing infrastructure. The solar system had to be designed to accommodate that, for example, to run the existing AC pumps. The same pump also runs regularly on the medium voltage power line or on a backup generator. And the idea was to solarize them and install inverters. This had implications on sizing and the choice of electrical equipment. We optimized the location. The difficult terrain required us to choose the initial location in order to avoid some very hard rock structures. And as an additional complication, land ownership in Arsal is not strongly documented. During both planning and implementation phase, several changes had to be accommodated as private entities claimed the supposedly public land. Taking into consideration irradiation data for summer and winter, we optimized the inclination. I will come back on this. Finally, the whole system is optimized for net cash saving after 10 years. While a bigger system size would allow us to operate for a longer time per day, it also means increased system cost. The system size was defined by optimizing the net cash saving after 10 years. This took also into consideration the cost of electricity from the grid and the operating cost of the backup generators in the time slots where the solar system is not the primary source of power. Finally, we had to take some safety issues into consideration because there is a nearby quarry where stone cutting is performed, and there is a risk of falling stones. And in winter, lightning poses an important risk to the installation. So it was necessary to install a fence to resist the stones and to have lightning protection. Next slide, please. Now, I present you the final system configuration. The implemented PV system integrates existing infrastructure again. So the submersible AC pump can be powered by the solar system or alternatively by the grid or a backup generator. Therefore, it was required to keep the old control panel in place, and the new control panel, however, is the master that allows to choose the power source automatically or manually. 480 panels are arranged in six strings with 16 modules each, and they produce a total power of 153.6 kilowatt. Each module is made up of 5 solar panels of 320 watt. The setup presented in the schematic does not really reflect the physical setup because the design had to be adapted. As you can see on the left, we have this hard rock formation, and on the right, you see this private land that was claimed. The system is optimized at an inclination of the panels of 15 degrees. In January, for example, this allows us a production of around 9,000 kilowatt hours compared with 10,000 kilowatt hours that would be possible at an inclination of 30 degrees. However, in order to avoid shading, a larger and therefore more expensive structure would be required. It was also taken into consideration that water consumption is higher in summer than in winter, and therefore we considered 50 degrees appropriate. It allows the pumps to run for 5.21 hours per day on average. It is worth mentioning that we installed a small water network that allows the operators to clean the panels from dust without scratching the PV panels, which then would affect their performance. Finally, there is a data acquisition system that records basic operating data of the pumping station, so the water part, and the PV installation, the solar part. Among the collected data, we have, for example, for the PV system, the ambient temperature, module temperature, solar irradiation, and of course, electrical data. And on the pumping system, we can read operating hours, electrical data, such as voltages and currents, or information on the water production. It would also be interesting to even go one step further and implement automation that allows the system to be remotely controlled. In terms of resilience, it would be a huge added value if the pumping station could be operated even if access is not possible due to, for example, security reasons. The system is quite significantly oversized in comparison with the pump. So 153.6 kilowatt solar versus 93 kilowatt of the pump. We did so in order to accommodate for existing loss factors, whether it is in cables or in the DC-AC conversion, etc. And also for potential future loss of performance due to a lack of proper maintenance. It also allows to maintain a good number of pumping hours even during winter time, something very important because we did not consider to install batteries due to price and maintenance requirements. The cost for supplying the installation of the installed system was about $150,000. Next slide, please. So to wrap up and conclude, I would like to present you some challenges that we faced throughout the project, but then finally also highlight the results. The challenges we faced are similar to the ones faced by any construction project. However, in a humanitarian setting, things can be a bit more complicated. So there was a limited choice of location, the geography, and we wanted what was limiting us, and then we wanted to be near to the pumping stations, and it left us not much choice but to build nearby a quarry. Depending on the wind direction, significant amounts of dust can accumulate on the panels and affect their performance. There is also an increased residual risk of falling stones, and furthermore, hard rock formations discovered during construction works made it necessary to work around and adapt the location and arrangement of these panels repeatedly. We faced land ownership issues. Despite being registered as public land, private entities made several claims throughout the project implementation. Handling the resulting delicate situations required a lot of attention and energy to be able to find positive resolutions of the conflicts. The location had to be slightly adapted last minute, with the implementing contractor already working on the site. Organizational environment. So the organizational environment is fragile, and this posed a big challenge. Although we clearly identified BK Water Establishment as the legal owner of the project, BWE, BK Water Establishment, however, did not yet have the capacity to take over the responsibility to operate and maintain the facility, both the water system and the solar system. So it is for that reason that we identified the ARSAL Water Committee as the entity currently in the best position to do so. While the integration of the Water Committee into the water establishment is foreseen in the near future, financial limitations do currently not allow to do so fast enough, and this leaves the project somewhat suspended in space, making it very difficult to identify the best way forward that would allow safe and sustainable operation of the facility. Then we faced issues regarding technical knowledge and skills of the operators. It is limited, and on top of that, the Water Committee members do not receive regular and substantial salaries. So daily operation and maintenance, despite tailored capacity building, remains deficient, and several issues were encountered after project completion. The solar panels are not being cleaned often enough, and in one particular case, faulty maintenance work done on the electrical system even damaged the pump again only shortly after it was commissioned. Integration with other systemic support activities is very important, but a challenge, namely when it comes to capacity building activities. While we did basic capacity building, it, however, focused mainly on the basic operational aspects of the new infrastructure, and it did not sufficiently take into consideration other aspects such as maintenance works and management, which should be taken on by the BK Water Establishment, but as we say, it's a little delayed. The aim is to integrate the Water Committee in the framework of BK Water Establishment to, in the long term, really secure this support. We plan to establish a cost recovery scheme to support this process, and until then, the Water Committee will continue to be the authority operating these systems. On the results that we achieved, we managed to increase the water production by 35.7%, which is an increase of 405 cubic meters per day that serves an additional 3,375 individuals. We have reduced the operational cost. Solar power is significantly cheaper than electricity from the grid or backup generators. We introduced redundancy. So in case the medium voltage power line is down, the solar system offers redundancy and allows water production for a minimum of 12 hours per day. And the solar system also helps to reduce the load on the only power line feeding ARSAL, making the grid more stable. Final slide, please. And it remains that I thank you for your attention and interest, and I warmly invite you to ask questions. Thank you very much.